Hello, hello! Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You were the reason why this content remains. Hit it on a roadie. Hit out on a highway. Looking for adventure. And today, we are going to talk about motorcycles in my never-ending quest to talk about the worst vehicles in the world that have ever been. I have now gotten to motorcycles. I happen to think motorcycles are very, very cool. But sometimes, like anything, they're very, very bad. These are 5 of the worst motorcycles ever. The 1972 Kawasaki H2 Mach IV. Now, this is on the list not necessarily because it was bad in a sense of performance. In fact, in terms of performance, it was actually astonishingly good. But there's a problem here, in that the actual design of the motorcycle could not compensate for the tremendous power that was delivered to it. It's probably worth mentioning, and I'm sure many of you definitely understand this, there is an inherent risk to riding a motorcycle. They can be dangerous. Anyone who rides regularly knows that there is some risk that you take whenever you ride on a motorcycle. If you get in an accident, you're far more likely to get seriously injured than if you were in pretty much any other kind of motorized vehicle. That being said, Kawasaki really went out of their way to make sure this is one of the most dangerous motorcycles you could possibly ride. See, the H1 actually was already known as kinda dangerous. The H2 is somehow even worse than that. The bike was fairly light, and what weight it did have was actually rear biased. That meant it was very easy to wheelie the thing. Now, that sounds cool, but only if the rider is ready for it and wants to do that. The H2s had a habit of doing that not on purpose, and that could result in, well, pain. Like, a lot of it. The forks on the front were way too thin for the amount of power it delivered too. In fact, the structural components of the bike in general were seemingly a lot weaker than they should have been for how much drive you could get out of its motor. An inexperienced rider would have a very, very bad time on this thing, but sources say that even pro riders often fought it to keep it under control. Kawasaki did take steps to prevent from getting sued. Safety modifications were added to both the 73 and 74 models. It may have occurred to them that it's really hard to sell motorcycles if you murder all your customers. The 1971 Suzuki TM400 Cyclone. Oh boy, this one's a little bit notorious actually. These bikes were produced by Suzuki from 1971 through 1975, and it was actually their premier motocross racing bike at the time. A brand new one was priced at a very affordable $999. I know it was the 70s and that was a lot more, but still, that wasn't bad. And the engine was claimed to have 40 horsepower, which when I talk about something like a locomotive, that sounds like nothing. But remember, these are motorcycles. On a light vehicle, 40 horsepower goes a long way. But the Cyclones had a number of issues that basically meant that the 40 horsepower meant nothing in their case. For one thing, they were hilariously overweight. The forks were cheap as heck, and the default shocks didn't last very long at all before needing to be replaced by something that wasn't a complete piece of junk. The chassis also had a habit of flexing, badly enough that it could actually bind up under load and then snap back to its proper form when the rider rolled off the throttle. Some enthusiasts still joke that the TM in TM400 actually stands for throw me, and the rider couldn't even really be expected to ease on the acceleration to avoid that problem because, frankly, the engine was actually completely inconsistent. Sometimes you'd barely get anything out of it, and then sometimes it would go off at full speed. It was basically impossible to know what it was going to do when you hit the accelerator. Over the years, Suzuki tried to amend some of its more grievous problems, but its legacy was already cemented. There was no saving it. The 1983 Kawasaki KX500. I know it doesn't look like it, but this bike, for what it's supposed to be, is actually big chungus. It was a large and powerful bike for the motocross scene. But unlike most of the other entries on this list, this is one case where the bike literally didn't work at all. No, seriously, you basically couldn't use it. It was so bad at first, especially, that the magazines that reviewed these things at the time couldn't actually test it in stock form, because the motor was so awful that it had a habit of just ripping itself to shreds when doing anything. Once the motor got a little bit hot, it would start rattling, and then basically blow up. Given this is supposed to be a motocross bike, and you're supposed to use it in, like, a race, and therefore ride it fast for a decent amount of time, this is kind of a major problem? The reason it happened is, well, knocking. It's something that can occur when the pressures and the temperature in the cylinder of the motor reach a point where the fuel charge can actually spontaneously ignite out of time with the normal cycle. If that happens, well, it can damage the motor. And it did. A lot. And the only way to fix it was to send the motor out to be reworked entirely. If it was left to its own devices, this was going to happen eventually, no matter what you did. Unless, of course, you just didn't ride the bike at all, in which case, yeah, but that's kind of defeats the purpose of having it, doesn't it? And the worst part is that the motor wasn't even its only issue. The KX, in its way, was actually a pretty tall bike. The seat height was 39 inches. That meant that anyone that was less than 6 feet tall would find it virtually impossible to start the thing without some kind of assistance. And even if you could get that far, the fact that it was tall meant it had a very high center of gravity, making the bike top-heavy, and therefore very difficult to turn without just falling over. The stock shocks on it were also terrible too, because of course they were, and the forks were considered very soft, which definitely didn't help matters. The 2004 Kawasaki KX500 and the Suzuki RM-Z250. Now, wait a minute, why would I put two bikes made by completely different manufacturers in the same spot on this list? Well, that's because they're basically the same bike. In fact, they were built in conjunction with each other. See, in the early 2000s, Kawasaki and Suzuki tried an experiment where they made a bike together in order to outdo their own mutual competition. To the untrained eye, you might assume they're different bikes, but anyone who is familiar with motocross machines will know that these are basically the same thing. The only difference of note was the color and shape of the radiator shrouds. Everything else was pretty much the same. The design was a combination of both manufacturers' practices, but it didn't really hit the good points of either choice. They basically combined their worst traits with each other, rather than their best. The motor was actually designed by Suzuki, but built by Kawasaki, and the chassis and the rest of the machine were all Kawasaki. As a result of this, even if you bought the Suzuki model, they handled way closer to Kawasaki's designs, which makes sense, but consumers didn't know that. A lot of its factors were fine. Just very, very, very fine. Like, the suspension was okay, and the forks were okay. There were minor issues there, but nothing really major. The real problem was the engine. It, as well as the mandatory components associated with it, broke constantly due to a variety of different failures. The design ran very hot, and had a habit of boiling its coolant after only a few minutes of slow riding. But that was only a minor issue. The major issue was the oil capacity, or rather lack thereof. These bikes did not feature an external oil tank. That's not unheard of, but that limited their overall oil capacity, which made cooling that much more difficult. Given the motors ran hot, oil was consumed very, very quickly when compared to other bikes. And it was apparently alarmingly easy to not realize you were that low on oil because you shouldn't have ran out that fast, and seize up your engine. But hey, you say, changing the oil is a regular part of any motor vehicle you own. And you're right. I change the oil in my car frequently, specifically to avoid this kind of problem. But of course, these bikes had to make that way more annoying than it had to be. The oil filter cover and the water pump were one piece. That means if you wanted to change the oil, you also had to drain the coolant first, meaning this already mildly irritating task of frequently changing your oil in these things because they burned it so fast was made that much more irritating. if you could get past all of that, they were also prone to a litany of other failures involving the cam buckets, the valves, and the valve seats, and the transmission would inevitably let go at some point. They were so terrible that Suzuki and Kawasaki almost immediately stopped working together. Each one blamed the other. Regardless of who was really to blame, the bikes were bad. The 2001 Cannondale MX400. Cannondale? That's not a brand I'm familiar with. What am I talking about? Well, I will happily explain this. Cannondale was not a new company, but new to the motorcycle scene. The company had been founded in 1971 in Bethel, Connecticut. At first, they only manufactured camping equipment as well as bicycle accessories. They were fairly successful, and in the 1980s, they started making their own bikes in general. Not motorcycles, regular bicycles. That went extremely well for them. So in 1998, they decided, you know what? Let's build a motorcycle. And truth be told, if they had gone with what they knew for sure would work, and not gotten weird and experimental with it, this probably would have turned out alright. So naturally they got weird and experimental with it, and it was awful. I understand the intention here. They wanted to distinguish themselves from the competition, but the way they did it wound up being they were just worse than their competition. For one thing, they used a radically different motor design that utilized a reverse cylinder with the intake at the front and the exhaust outlet in the back. They also decided to use fuel injection tech as well as an electric starter on the motorcycle. Now, those features are on bikes these days. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was very unusual. Now, in terms of the intake placement, well, it does make some sense, at least on paper. You just wind up with better flow if you mounted it on the front, towards the direction where the motorcycle would be moving, and have the exhaust going straight out the back. You also would have less pipe routing to worry about too. Additionally, a fuel injector could indeed improve performance, and an electric starter would just be easier. So it's not like any of the ideas were necessarily bad, but when they implemented all this together, it basically just didn't work at all. For one thing, the Ram Air airbox they were utilizing behind the front number plate was not actually up to par when it came to getting enough air to the 400cc mill. The motor needs air to function, and if it can't get enough of it, it'll just suffocate. In order to fix this, they actually added a second air filter under the tank to help the motor out, and that did technically solve that problem, but that meant that whenever you had to clean the air filters, you would have to basically disassemble the whole bike in order to get to the secondary one. So, thank you for that. The short rear exit exhaust pipe also caused performance issues, believe it or not. It was too short to properly tune to the power output. And tuning a motorcycle with fuel injection technology is not the same thing as tuning it without that, making that problem even worse. When it was put on sale in the fall of the year 2000, it was arguably still not actually finished, and Cannondale kinda knew it. They had sunk a ton of money into developing this bike, and they rushed production to try to get something out there for people to buy. But it only made their situation worse because once people actually started using the things, every single problem came to light, and even more would be found. Remember, this is a dirt bike. It's meant for motocross. Well, the motor on the bike was, rather big. The lower section actually jutted forward and hung pretty low, which is really asking for it to just plow into the dirt at some point. And it was heavy. Really heavy. Way heavier than basically every other dirt bike on the market. It was over 260 pounds! And there are some heavy bikes out there, and they can be designed in such a way where you don't really notice how heavy they are once you get them going. The Cannondale was not one of these. It technically had very good suspension components, but they weren't set up very well, and the forks were too soft for how heavy the Cannondale was. And even if you took the time to correct the suspension issues, the bike still was known not to handle very well purely because it was so heavy. If you rode it in a straight line, it would be alright, but it did not enjoy turning. And then there was the motor. The electric starter was actually flawed. It didn't work reliably. You could start the motor pretty well cold, but if it got hot and you had to restart the bike, it basically never worked. And the worst part is that there was no kickstart backup. So you literally had to use the electric starter, or if you were close enough to a hill and bump started it. The point was, this is ridiculous. Technically, when it was working, the motor itself was on par with the competitors, but it was on a bike that was 40 pounds heavier than the others. So of course it's not going to work as well. And the fuel injector didn't work reliably either, giving erratic performance and poor low-end response. And the early models of the bike had a habit of just breaking entirely. They simply stopped working. The frames were notoriously fragile. And again, motocross! To Cannondale's credit, they tried to adjust pretty much every problem that I've mentioned so far, and by the end of the production line, the bikes were actually a lot better, but the first year was so bad that it completely tainted the entire brand from that point forward. And Cannondale Motorcycles filed bankruptcy in 2003. And with that, a special thank you goes to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hawk 444, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Consume 131-232, Mr. Blackrose, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Dean Trouble Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Major Klutz, Hayden DeGrow, Ohio Trucker 1, and Master of None. Till next time, this is Darkness, Individual Lafon, farewell.